Hola, boa tarde, good afternoon. My name is Thomas Cauvin, and I will talk today about public history. I hope you can hear me and you can see me. Could you maybe write in the comments if you can hear me, if you can see me, so that I'm sure everything's going well. So, hey, for those who just joined me, I'm gonna talk today about public history. My name is Thomas Cauvin, and I'm gonna monitor the chat, the comments to see if you can hear and see me. So if you could just please tell me if you can hear and see me in the comment section. We're gonna wait a few minutes for people to join. You can also, if you wish, in the comment section, write, where you're from, and maybe who you are, if you work in a museum, if you are a student. So you can use the chat, the comment section, to tell me more about you. We're gonna wait a few minutes for all of you to join. Again, my name is Thomas Cauvin. In a few minutes, I will start discussing public history. It seems that I don't see any complaint in the comments, so you should be able to hear me and see me. Good afternoon, Lucas. Good afternoon, Andrew. Thank you for joining. Again, we're gonna wait a few more minutes. You can see in the description of the live discussion that I added a few links. You have two links, one for the International Federation for Public History. The other one is the forum that we have on Facebook. So feel free to visit those websites. Again, we're gonna wait a couple of more minutes. I'm gonna talk in English, but you will be able to ask your questions in Portuguese, in French if you want. Natalia gently proposed to translate the question in Portuguese to me, so you will be able to ask your question in Portuguese if you want. And I already take this opportunity to thank the team of Historia en Cuarentena for this great project, for the great online discussions, and for inviting me to this talk. So good afternoon, Malena. Good evening, Anita, because I know it's late in Luxembourg. If you're just joining, I'm waiting a couple of more minutes to start the discussion so that nobody misses anything from the talk. You can say in the comment section if you have any issue with the sound or with the video. My Wi-Fi should work, so that should be all right. Again, I added two links in the description if you want to visit what we discuss in the forum of the International Federation for Public History. All right, so the organizers said that we can start. So thank you, Natalia. So hola, boa tarde, good afternoon. My name is Thomas Cauvin, and today I'm gonna talk about public history, the reinvention of history and public history during the time of the pandemic. I am very, very, very happy to be with you today, virtually, but still, because I've always been impressed by the amount of work in public history in Brazil. So I'm very happy to be there to discuss with you public history. I know that Historia en Cuarentena is a team effort, but I would like to give a special thank you to Natalia. Hi, Natalia, and De Santana and Paulo Cesar Gomez for inviting me, for taking care of everything So a big thank you to both of you. As I said, I'm gonna speak in English, but you can ask questions in Portuguese. Natalia will translate them to me. Or in French if you want to ask your questions in French. And later on, I will be happy to share more resources about the project that I mentioned in this talk. So a few things about me. I am French, but I've been working in the United States for the past 7 years. I'm about to start a new job in Luxembourg, at the University of Luxembourg. So I say hi to my future colleagues and hi to my past colleagues. I've been interested in public history for a while, teaching public history, training, practicing public history. I have done a lot of communication and history, and that's the topic of this week. I've done documentary films, I've done podcasts for historians, and I've done exhibitions, the last one being a co-produced exhibition with my students on the history of beer, global history of beer. It's been quite popular. So I'm interested in the public interaction when we do and practice history. Last, but maybe not least, I'm the president of the International Federation for Public History. I know that you have other members of the federation talking this week on Thursday and on Saturday. So that tells you about the connection between the Brazilian networks and the International Federation. I've put 2 links in the description of that live video about the International Federation and the forum that we have. So feel free to visit our page. So the topic of this week, which is very, very rich, is about the production and the spread of history during the times of the crisis. Production, communication, spread are connected to public history. Right? I always thought that we needed public history, but I think the current situation forces us to do even more public history. Definitions of public history vary depending the country, the profile, the approaches. But I think I could start with sharing some of my personal views about public history. Natalia, if you could share the image in the comment that I asked you before about the tree. Because last week, one of my articles was published in Spanish. It's an open access, so I can give you the link. The article was about defining public history, but also showing the challenges of public history, right? And I consider public history very much as a tree with different parts. So I don't know if Natalia, you were able to share the document in the comment section. For some reason, I cannot see the comment section here. But the way I see public history is divided into different parts. The roots, the trunk, the branches, and the leaves, so a tree, right? The roots being the creation of archives, the collections, the trunk being the interpretation of history, the branches being the communication of history. So by communication, it could be a podcast, it can be a film, it can be a tour. Those are the communication practices. And finally, the leaves of the tree. The leaves being the uses by people, by partners, by institutions, the uses of history. And what's important is that all those parts, the roots, the trunk, the branches, and the leaves are interconnected. To give you an example, today, during the crisis, we need to create memories. We want to keep memories of the situation. So we create new, for example, oral histories. So we create new sources because of present need. That's what I mean by interconnecting the uses, the communication, and the creation of sources. So that's how I see public history. Communication is key, it's very important in public history. But communication is not enough. For me, a big and a major part of public history is participation and collaboration, right? So today I want to focus more on how we can communicate together, how we can practice together public history. So the title is Rethinking Public History, the Long-Term Impacts of the Quarantine. And Natalia, let me know if there's any issue for the document. So I would like to divide my talk into three parts. First, historians during time of crisis, then how the crisis affects history, and then finally how the crisis affects the public in public history. Let me double check the time. All right. So time of crisis, it's a very dramatic situation in terms of health, economic issues, family issues, cultural issues, and the crisis will impact the humanities as other fields. We can already foresee a decrease in public funding, cultural institutions, universities, teaching, and historians will suffer as others, right? But they will suffer in a broader defiance too, right? In 2007, during the last financial crisis, the impact on history was dramatic because in universities, we had less and less students who wanted to study history because of the crisis. They wanted something more solid. They were thinking about a more useful career, right? Like science or engineering, right? So during time of crisis, we have to show the relevance of history. And crises are times where and when historians have to reinvent their field. And the situation is seen as historical, right? People think that or see, and they're probably right, that the situation will never be the same again, right? So they see the situation as a crisis, something that will never be the same. That's what Pierre Nora, the French historian, called the acceleration of history. And when times change, people are scared to lose what they have, obviously, but they also they're scared to lose their memories, right? And that's why, being scared of losing our memories, we create what Pierre Nora has called the lieu de mémoire, these realms of memory. When we want to freeze memories, right, in the times of crisis, for example, at the end of a war, we erect monuments because we want to freeze those memories. And I see the multiple projects about the COVID-19, preserving the memories, as the same thing, like a digital monument in which we want to preserve the memories. And historians are the core of that process of freezing memories. So historians are useful. Historians are important. But it's not new. Historians working in the present. Let's think about Herodotus in Greece, the father of history. What was he doing? He was documenting the Greco-Persian War. And he called his book The Histories, right? So he was already documenting the present, preserving the present. Other examples include the School of the Annales in France. Lucien Febvre, after the First World War, started a long discussion and reflection about how to change the field of history that led to the creation of the Annales in 1929. Right? So crises make us think, and historians as well, about the future. Right? I'm going to show you a map later about the various projects that archives memories of COVID-19. And one argument is we want to work for the future historians. We want to create today the archives for tomorrow, right? We want to preserve this exceptional moment. So it's a projection into the future. But that projection forces us to rethink about what kind of history we want to do and we want to do in the future. There's this great book from Michel Rolfe-Trouillot about silencing the past, right? And historians today, thinking about the future, also think about how they're themselves silencing part of the current situation. So they have this self-reflection about what they're doing. This is what I call when I say that the historians have to reinvent history in times of crisis. But what kind of reinvention, right? I think first that we're going to need and we're going to practice more and more public history. Collecting, preserving the present. This is not new. You had this project in the 1930s in the UK, United Kingdom, where historians started the mass observation project, when they asked people to document through diaries their lives, right? So documenting the present is not new for historians, but we can foresee a boom of this kind of practice. Maybe, Natalia, you can share in the comment the second link that I sent you, which is the link to the map of various projects all over the world that archives and document the COVID-19 memories. And you can see a few examples in Brazil. I'm sure there are more than that, but it's an ongoing project. So we've been mapping various projects. There are more in the US because the project started in the US, but obviously you have projects in Australia and Europe and all over the world. Those different projects of COVID-19 memories are also connected to what we call the rapid response collecting. Rapid response collecting started in archives and museums, which is basically collecting current situation. There were examples about the Brexit in the UK when museums started to collect about the Brexit. And the COVID-19 examples are pretty much the same thing, collecting the current situation. And what is the role of historians? Because we could, think about this project simply done by archivists or librarians. Historians are important because there is a need of this historical perception in the present. Something that Armitage and Gildy in their history manifesto stress very much. We need the long-term history in the present situation. And historians have been working on the various dramatic events. The COVID-19 is one, but you have examples in the United States, for example, about the 9/11 digital archives, or the Hurricane Memory Bank, which was about the Hurricane Katrina. There are examples of the terrorist attack in Paris in 2015 and the work of historians documenting the situation. So we have this boom of rapid collecting. And what skills do we need as historians to take part in those projects? First, I think historians need not only to study archives, but they need to be able to create archives and preserve archives, right? So I teach my students not only to study the sources, but to create sources, to preserve sources, archiving, copyrights. I think this is very important for historians to be actors of the process. Obviously, also digital skills. Recent reports have showed that more than 80% of museums in Europe have increased their digital resources. That means not only virtual exhibition, but interaction, communication. Historians need to be able to do podcast, video editing, and digital interaction. So I think it's important for historians to be able to master those skills if they want to be part of the discussion. There's also a boom in oral history. There have been oral history for a long time, and there are a lot of projects actually in Brazil. I think that the current situation develops oral history even more. Next week, we will have a discussion with the International Federation for Public History with Michael Frisch, who wrote the Shared Authority book, Oral History. He's going to talk about peak story and how the short form stories help us to change public history. So new digital skills for oral history. So historians need more skills than ever to be part of the discussion. The crisis, I think, also forces us to rethink the role of historians, especially in the rise of co-production. I'm not going to explain in details what co-production means because it's a big topic, but you had examples of co-production in the 1990s, I mentioned that Michael Frisch wrote his book, Shared Authority in 1990, but you had other examples of public history of disability, for example, in the United Kingdom, in which historians, scholars were working with associations to create together a history of disability in the UK. I think the crisis forces us to develop even more co-production. So that's why I'm about to start a 5-year project in Luxembourg called Public History as the New Citizen Science of the Past, in which I use what's been done in citizen science, crowdsourcing, community sourcing to enlarge it to public history at large, and to balance participation and rigorous methodology, which is not always easy. How do you reconcile conflicting representation of the past, for example? And I think that public history is not only sharing a product. I do think that public history is designing framework, designing spaces of participation between scholars, witnesses, public institutions. Tomorrow, Bruno Leal will talk about Café Historia and his great, influence. We can also mention the Corona Archive, the German example of memorizing and collecting memories of the COVID-19. And they consider the Corona Archive as a container, right? A space where people can share their stories. And I think that public history is very much about this, creating a space of discussion, creating the tools for public participation. And I don't think we're there yet. We have examples of some participation, public participation. I've mentioned the 9/11 digital archives in the US, where people could upload items, memories. So people can help collecting stories or giving their stories. But very often the publics, the different groups, are not part of the second step, the interpretation of history. And I think there is a need to develop co-production, not only for the collecting, the roots in the tree, but also the trunk, the interpretation, and the communication. So developing co-production in the different steps. One great example, a current example, is a project developed by Jason Kelly in the United States about the oral history of COVID-19. The project is not only creating oral histories of COVID-19, but there are some tutorials for people to become interviewers. A short training. They won't be professional historians, but they can get the skills to interview people, right? And public history is about this, sharing the skills as well. So tutorials and trainings are important to share the skills. You even have projects in which the public can do some research. There was a few years ago this project at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in which people, participants, were helping to document the lives of 14,000 kids during World War II, Jewish kids, and the project was about what happened to them. And the public, different participants, were helping not only in collecting, but in finding resources, finding sources, interpreting sources with tutorial about this. So this is an example of what I meant when I said that the co-production should be extended not only to the collect, but to the interpretation. There are other examples in which, mentioning one in France, there is a large project in France called Rupture or Breakdown, in which teachers and school children from all over the country are researching people to interview, creating oral history, interpreting oral history to be put in the final memory bank. And in that project, the students are not only collecting, but they are actors of the process. And that's a beautiful project because it puts the kids, the children, into the process, right? The sources are created, analyzed by them, right? So that's what I like in public history when different participants can become actors of the process, Obviously, there are some issues and challenges. That's what I meant by balancing the rigorous methodology and the participation. So we still need to find guidelines, but I think that's the way to go. Finally, one aspect I foresee in the future, and remember, this is an ongoing project process. It's a very humble, thought about what could be the future of public history. One aspect that I foresee is a boom in what we call applied history. Applied history is sometimes synonymous with public history, with a difference is that applied history is about the application of history, usually in public policy, urban policy, or in that case, health policy. There's been an example, although the feedback are not so good, about historians involved in Germany in advising what to do for the crisis. Even though their input was very limited, that's what I mean by applied history. Historians being part of the current discussion about COVID-19. And what can historians bring? For example, they can show historical example of what has worked in previous pandemic. There was a pandemic in 1918, not the Spanish flu, another flu, 1918 in San Francisco. Huge pandemic. And historians have studied what worked and what didn't work there. They closed schools, and what worked, what didn't work. Obviously, the context was different, and the comparison is always tricky. But studying what has worked in the past can be useful in the present. And again, there are some limits, and it's quite controversial, but historians being part of current discussion and decision about health policy is one aspect that I foresee in the next few months. I'd like to conclude about one question, because I want to keep some time for the Q&A, which is always the best part of the discussion. The conclusion is about, so what about international public history? Something I've been very keen in developing. So is there any future for international public history? To some extent, I'm a bit worried in the sense that we see the strengthening of the national framework. We've seen borders in Europe, because of the quarantine. So the return of the, nation state because of the relief fund, the strategy. So we see the national framework as coming back. It never disappeared, but coming back in a very powerful way. We've been hearing discussion about national economic independence in Europe. So how would that affect public history? Are we going back to or are we discussing national public history? Although the situation is global. So that's something, I don't have an answer, but that's something I've been wondering. On the other hand, are we witnessing a return to the local? Many of the projects on the map that I can show you later if it didn't work, of projects that document the lives and memories of COVID-19 are about one city, one neighborhood, right? So very local. One reason is that, we are in quarantine, so we can't travel, we can't move. So the memory is very much localized in space. There's no tourism, which one main aspect of international public history. So I'm wondering if there's an influx of local public history connected to the COVID-19, which may sound obvious, but that's something we could discuss. And finally, I do think we still need transnational and international public history. We can talk about the differences, but transnational, international. That's what the International Federation for Public History does, to connect different projects. The map is very much an example of connecting an oral history project in Japan with an oral history project in Brazil, right? Because public history is not that much about the facts. Public history is very much a process, right? So a problem that my Japanese colleague may have in Tokyo, archiving tweets, for example, may very much be the same problem that you have in Brasilia, right? So the process, public history as a process, is a wonderful platform to discuss how we do history, why we do history, the tools, the skills. Because I always tell my students, if you can do a virtual exhibition in Colorado today, I'm pretty sure you can do a virtual exhibition tomorrow in Germany. Obviously, the contents are different, but the structure may be the same. And public history offers this wonderful opportunity to discuss because we talk about similar problems. We talk about what is the role of historian today during the COVID-19. And this discussion, French working in the US, talking with Brazilian colleagues is a very good example of that. We're talking about how we do history together. All right, so enough about my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. As I said, you can ask your questions for the comments to Natalia. We have a Google Doc, so she can translate the questions. And I can also forward you more resources. So I'm gonna switch to the Google document and maybe give you some time for more questions. Thank you very much. All right, so I see already a good number of questions. Thank you. That's very useful. And I will maybe try to answer questions by questions. So the first question, and I'm going to repeat the question. Hello, Thomas. Hello. I'm worried about the format, about how historians continue in general to make an unattractive history for the great public. Are we afraid of losing some academic legitimacy? How can we combine research in an attractive form? Good question. Whoever asked the question. I think that a good historical research can also be what I call sexy research. To give you an example, my last class was about making documentary film as historian. And one of my students chose the representation of sexuality for Queen Elizabeth I. So kind of difficult topic about sexuality, gender, and she did a great video in 4 minutes about this. I don't think there's any opposition between good historical research and attractive history. Attractive history has to be communicated in a public-friendly manner. So you have to learn how to speak in public, how to make a podcast, how to make a tour. Tour guides are great examples too. So I do think there's a place for good and attractive research, but we need training, how to speak, how to create a website. So it was Carlos. Thank you, Carlos, for your question. I do think it's possible. A question from Lucas Pedretti. Hi, Thomas. Thank you. Which role do you think the historian can play in the fight against negationism? I mean, we have to be there. And this is a question also about public participation and rigorous methodology, right? Negationism, but also other examples like in the United States, the Confederate monuments, or even racist comments and history. Historians have to be there. We cannot ignore those debates, those talk. But in order to be efficient as an historian and to be part of the public sphere, because that's what matters. If you argue in a journal between peers about why you're right and what they're wrong, the impact may not be as good. But if you have the tools to discuss in the public, and Cafe History is one great example, if you have the tools to make history and to share history and to somehow fight some of those views, you need the tools for that. You need the skills. So I do think that historians have to be part of it. We cannot disconnect the present and the past. If you want me to answer how to do it, I think we need 1 more hour of discussion. But I do think, Lucas, that we have to be there. And maybe if we have time, I can come back to that question later. A question from Michelle. Hi, Michelle Kobylinski. My questions are about ethics and public history. Yes. In Brazil, unfortunately, for instance, some researchers work with people and communities and do not submit the project to ethics committees. Okay. In your article in the magazine Hispania Nova, so the article that we mentioned previously, it is said that ethics and ethical practices are fundamental to public history. Yes. Could you talk more about this topic? What ethical precautions do you recommend when preparing and applying a project in public history? Thank you. Great question, Michelle. Big question. Yes, ethics are fundamental, and ethics should be in academic training courses. You should have courses for students and for historians about ethics. I mean, ethics depend the field, right? Last week we were talking about ethics and co-production, right? There are many different ethics. One of them is that if it is co-production, everything has to be discussed with your partners. If you work with a community to do the history of a neighborhood, the topic, the framework, the sources should be all discussed. You need a memorandum of agreement to know where you're going, what's the objective of the project, so that nobody is taken aback once the project is done. So I cannot talk about all the different ethics. The National Council for Public History has published twice already a guideline in ethics for public history that I could send you the link for. But ethics are fundamental. And what my project in Luxembourg is trying to do is to build ethics and guidelines for co-production, right? Because there is no such thing. So it's a partial answer to you, Michelle, about ethics. It's key. I always teach ethics, for example, contract and consulting. What are your rights? What do you have to do as a consultant in terms of ethics? Who do you answer to? Your clients, the public, the profession. So those are difficult questions. No single answer, but definitely something that has to be taught and discussed. But again, depends if it's a museum, archive, digital, physical, trust. You have ethics and trust, native history. In the United States, you have specific ethics to deal with difficult topics. So yes, Michelle. The next question is from Malena Bedoya. Hi, Malena. Good to read you. In many communities, in many community processes, many files are generated with the community. Yes, and that connects to the ethics. When we think about the issue of archives and the management of them for the community, how can we historians participate if many times these communities are far from the place where we work? How do we activate these archives? I think your question partly connects with Michelle's question about ethics. The first thing is that when you work with a community, the community has to have a voice in what you're doing. For example, in our history, the oral history is coming from someone. That person has to get his or her voice in what you do with the oral history. And the community should be it should be acknowledged as an actor and not a source. That's what I deeply think. Communities are actors in the co-production. They're not sources. The second part of your question, how can we participate if those communities are remote? Well, and that connects to the current situation of the COVID-19 and the digital public history. That's why I think that we can foresee more digital public history coming, but not digital public history in simply communicating history. Digital public history as a platform of co-production, right? This can be useful for remote discussion. Again, I'm not sure about the example that you mentioned and how we can I'm not sure what you mean by activate these archives. But the role of public history is to create those platforms of co-creation, co-production. And in that way, I think that you could work remotely about the archives. That's what the new tools, big story from Michael Frisch or their story from Zach Ellis that we're going to talk about next week is also about doing. Distance online public history. So I hope it partly answered your question, Malena. A question from Anita. Hi, Anita, a future colleague in Luxembourg. So Anita's question. I like very much your emphasis on the process. We know that there are scattered suggestions of best practices, but what about the failures in these processes? Which are the problems and main risks for a public history project to fail in this context of crisis, for instance? Thank you, Anita. Good question. Failures are important, and that should always be part of the feedback of the discussion. Last week on co-production, we have discussed failures when some people, for example, quit the project, right? The question, why do they quit, right? And co-production is a very difficult process, and many failures. What are the problems and main risks for a public history project to fail in this context of crisis? It's a good question. I'm not sure I know the solution and the answers. Maybe the sustainability of the project. There are so many projects that collect the memories of the COVID-19 by city, by library. That is going to be super time consuming to manage the data. And so many projects are done in a rush because it's rapid collecting, that the issue of sustainability, preservation of the data are not taken care of. So we may end up in many projects for which we lose the data because the structure has not been thoroughly thought about. So I think there's a risk of losing data, and I know you know that. This is one thing. I think another risk, it's not so much a risk, I think it's a challenge, is to keep this co-production aspect of what we're doing today, to keep it tomorrow. It's not because we're gonna go back not to normality, but something more public, that we need to lose this co-production, right? For some reason, co-production sounds better when it's digital, but when it moves to physical, we kind of lose that. So there may be a challenge of continuing the co-production aspect of digital public history, your project, the C2GH project. There may be a challenge of losing it once, and hopefully we will, turn into a more public physical project. So turning digital public history and not losing sight with the public and physical objects or discussion might be a challenge. And if you want an example of a failure for the COVID-19 memory, I think it's too early. The best project I've seen are projects that do not only ask people to send an item, but give people a voice in the project. There's this example, I think it's the House of Austrian History in Vienna, that it's a museum, I think it's the Museum of Austrian History, that has a virtual exhibit that uses the direct input of the participants. So not only collecting and putting all the data in the database, but putting directly the data in the virtual exhibit. So the exhibit changes every day depending on what people want to see and what people add. So it's not only collecting and then the voice of the people is over, but it's having the people in the project as well. contribute to the decision of what do you want to see, what matters for you, what do you see that you like, that you would like to preserve. I think that's a very good practice that we should keep doing. I have a question from Natalia. Hi, Natalia, and thank you for the questions. So the question is, how does public history think theoretically about this relationship between the past and the present? What do we think about the so-called scientific distance? Thank you, Natalia. Well, I've been trained as an academic historian, and as you know, the rule for academic history is to distance yourself from the present. This is a very old tradition in which you need to be to reach for objectivity, and there's no objectivity if you're connected to the present, which is a wish, obviously, because we are all connected to the present. The topic that you choose for your research is already connected to the present, right? The subjectivity of the researcher is part of the research. I think that our subjectivity, why we choose a topic, should be part and should be acknowledged. We should be honest in our research, right? Why we choose that topic, or even better, why are we choosing to work with that community and not that one, right? Is it because we share some values with those people and we consider that the other are racist or negationist? It's a choice, right? So I think that this choice should be acknowledged and part of the project. Why and how are we doing history? And public history, that's been a criticism, public history is connected to the present. Some people say that public history is answering the demand of public groups or the present, which is partly true. When we collect memories about COVID-19, it's because there's a need, right? So I don't see any problem about connecting past and present, even connecting past, present, and future. It doesn't mean that there's a bias, right? So the space, thank you, Natalia, the space and the place of the historian should be acknowledged. That's what Michel Rolf-Trouillot, in his book about silencing the past, mentioned, right? We are silencing some people, even if we're not aware of that. So we need this self-reflection about what we are doing, and this self-reflection starts from the present. So I don't see. I know that some of my colleagues would disagree. I don't see any problem with that. Thank you, Natalia. I have another question from another Natalia. Thank you, Natalia. So the question is, it is a pleasure to listen to you. Thank you, Natalia. As you said before, public history is also about sharing skills with the big public. Yes. In some extent, I worry about that, though, since as historians, we face problems with the legitimacy of our profession. Yes. Especially in countries as Brazil. Yes. If we share some of our skills with the big public, is it possible that we lose even more our importance in the process of researching and interpreting history, since some specificities of our profession would be shared? Thank you, Natalia. A very good question. And I initially had planned to talk more about the current situation in Brazil, which is very important and discussed in other countries. What's a professional historian? Is there a professional historian? I know you've been discussing about that in Brazil, but there have been some echoes in Italy, in Poland about that, in the US too, because our political leaders have the tendency to discredit higher education and scholarship. By sharing authority, and we go back to Michael Frisch, sharing authority doesn't mean that we all have the same expertise, right? If let's say you're a historian, you work with a community about their history, and you work with community historians, you work with a museum, right? You all have expertise, but in different levels, right? I'm not saying that we should all share and all become experts in contextualizing the past, because that's what historians do. We put the past into a context. We have this critical methodology to study sources. we study sources as representative or not of a context. So that's something we do, something we're trained for. It doesn't mean that a witness or a community historian doesn't have some expertise. They have different expertise. And the beauty of co-production is that we can add different expertise. So in the end, public history is not weaker, it's not more weak than academic history. I even think it can be stronger because you may be able to add different expertise, a list of expertise, a list of knowledge, right? And like a peer review between community, museums, and historians. The only difference is that when you write a PhD, for example, you're usually the master of your interpretation. In public history, you may have to discuss and convince why your expertise and why your conclusion matters. So to answer your question, I hear you, and I know what you mean, because some people could use public history to say, well, if you want to share, if everybody can be an historian, we don't need historians. It's not true. It's a different level of expertise. So we should not give up our expertise, but expertise goes way beyond academic expertise. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but I think this is the discussion today about co-production, balancing what we do, the rigorous methodology, but also accepting that some groups, that some colleagues, that some institutions have their own expertise and a way of seeing things, right? It reminds me, since it's last question, I think I have some more minutes to deal with that. It reminds me of the discussion about conflicting representation of the past. If you have a topic and if different people have different representation of the meaning of that event, right? How do you share authority? Yes, Natalia, it's over. So just one line to say that we may have different representation of one event. It doesn't mean that it's a lack of history, right? You have a context, you have sources, and you can still have people who have their own representation, right? Doesn't mean that we lose expertise. So it seems that it's over. Again, I would like to thank Natalia, Paolo, and the whole team of Historia en Cuarentena. I'm gonna save the video, and the video will be available very soon on their YouTube channel. So thank you very much for your attention. You have my contact if you want to reach me. It was a pleasure to talk with you. Have a nice evening, have a nice day, and hope to see you again soon.